Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar about elections in the pandemic. This webinar series is organized by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. This is the fifth installment in our webinar series, following the first one back in May about the administration of elections in a pandemic, the second about disinformation, the third about the full participation of youth, and the fourth about the inclusiveness of electoral processes for persons with disabilities. I'm Magnus, and I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the IFES Europe office in Prague, which is hosting this event. IFES is a non-governmental, non-profit organization that supports electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have been assisting elections in European countries since the late 1980s. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible by the generous support of the American people. As societies become ever more reliant on technology, the processes around us become increasingly digitized. And this is also the case with elections, where computerized systems are now indispensable, and election management bodies rely on technology with the aim to improve electoral processes. But with every new technology integrated into the electoral process, new risks emerge, including the use of systems that are immature, misunderstood, or that create opportunities for malicious actors to interfere with the security and the integrity of elections. And cybersecurity has become even more important now during the pandemic, as online communication has increased dramatically, including this webinar, and technological solutions are sought to protect electoral processes at a time when traditional approaches are difficult or not possible. To address the safeguarding of electoral integrity through better cybersecurity, we have with us in this webinar prominent experts on various areas of elections and technology. First, we will hear from the IFES Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia, Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz, who will introduce the topic and address what IFES is doing in this field. After her, we will listen to Thomas Chanussot, who is election cybersecurity and technology expert. He will talk about opportunities and challenges with new services offered by technology in the electoral process. The next speaker will be David Levine, Elections Integrity Fellow, the Alliance for Securing Democracy within the German Marshall Funds of the United States. And he will address securing election technologies from foreign adversaries, which include some ways to prevent, detect, and recover from political attacks. We will hear reflections from Meredith Applegate, Program Advisor to IFES Ukraine, and she will focus on considerations about internet voting from a cybersecurity perspective. And our final speaker will be Robert Krimmer, Professor in e-commerce at the University of Tartu. He will focus on the importance of careful decisions and capacity considerations regarding the use of technology in the pandemic. We'll then open for questions to our panelists and for comments. If you have any questions or any comments, you can at any time type that in using the chat function. Before we start this webinar, you may have noticed that there is an election happening in the United States next week. I encourage everyone to join the IFES US election program, through which you can access a lot of information and presentations by experts from a wide range of topics on the US electoral process. You access the IFES US election program by going to usep.ifes.org. That's usep.ifes.org. And we are pasting that link into the chat right now. I will give more details about this at the end of the webinar as well. I will now hand over the word to Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz, the IFES Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia. Please, Beata.
Thank you very much, Magnus. And good morning to everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you very much all for joining IFES and our REAPS program in Prague for this session 5 on cybersecurity and technology and how we can safeguard electoral integrity through better cybersecurity. As Magnus has mentioned, cyber threats and cyber response have become a key feature of election and discussions over the past half decade. And various incursions and attacks, including in the US, in the Republic of Georgia, in Ukraine, in other countries of this region and other regions, have really led to a heightened understanding of the importance of this issue to electoral democracy and to maintaining public confidence in electoral processes. At the same time, we are facing new and constantly changing strategies from threat actors, both foreign and domestic. And this is even further heightened by warnings from agencies such as the FBI and the USA CISA, as well as last week's indictments by the US Ministry of Justice, working in cooperation with the UK's NCSC. And this really highlights the continued threat that cybersecurity and cyber incursions pose. In this context, and being more than a half year into the COVID-19 pandemic, this has also thrown up additional challenges and risks. And it's my pleasure to open this working session on what has proven to be a consistent and persistent concern to both democracy and elections. This month and next see a number of key elections in the Europe-Eurasia region, including Kyrgyzstan earlier this month, Ukraine last Sunday, Georgia this coming weekend, Moldova and Bosnia-Herzegovina at the start of November. And in all of these countries, many election management bodies are now using some degree of technology with the aim of improving electoral processes, which also brings its additional challenges. Within the Europe-Eurasia area, there is limited electronic voting within the states. However, there has been an increase in ancillary online services for voters, for candidates, for other electoral stakeholders, and these all create a larger attack surface and increased vulnerabilities that need to be taken into account. These include technological solutions ranging from voter list systems, updating voter registration, constituency delimitation, online online campaign finance regimes. And all of these elements run the risk of causing problems in the electoral process, or even causing chaos or misinformation, as they did in the case where Ukraine's tabulation of results reflection was disrupted in 2014. And many of you will know the now famous story of Viktor Yarosh being declared the winner in Moscow at the same time that that attack was happening, and presenting false information of a candidate that had less than 1% support, obviously undermining the narrative of a democratic election in that case. IFES has been working increasingly in this space over the past 2 years. We've been implementing cutting-edge cybersecurity and election assessments across the region and increasingly across the globe. We've been conducting innovative election technology and cyber hygiene trainings at the country, regional, and soon global level. Initially, these trainings were in person in cooperation with Taltech University in Tallinn, Estonia. Since the COVID crisis, we've now moved to an online platform, which is also innovative in the way that it approaches participants in an interactive and multifaceted learning environment. And our next iteration of this training will be taking place next month for this regional program. As well, we're increasing our capacity to work with EMBs in upgrading their systems, in developing strategic risk mapping exercises, in developing strategic response plans, and also in terms of developing partnerships with international organizations and with international actors such as Microsoft or Google or Cloudflare, who are very important to this equation. And so it's with great pleasure that I have an introduction to the great panel of experts that we have today, including, as Magnus mentioned, Thomas, David, Mara, and Robert Krimmer. I very much look forward to their upcoming presentations, and I also look forward to a robust discussion with all of the participants who have been able to join today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the continuing discussion.
Thank you very much, Beata. And we will now listen to Thomas Chanussot, election cybersecurity and technology expert. Thomas, please.
Thank you. You should be able to see my screen. Okay, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, the attendance. So really, my presentation, I really want to focus on the fact that despite the COVID-19 and more than 4 billion people who were ordered to stay at home, like all sectors, like most sectors, EMB had to continue to operate and adjust the way they work under very difficult conditions, whether it was to deploy online training programs to train poll workers or to any other functions of the electoral process, the shift to online meetings, or even allowing people to work from home. All of this had to be done in order for EMBs to continue to operate. Similarly, many of the services that EMBs were providing to voters, they had to be sometimes partially, sometimes completely shifted to online services. So really here I want to focus on a little bit on the challenges that this represent for many of these EMBs, but also the opportunities that it can represent for them in the long run. So in an accelerated pace of digitalization, I mean, it's as Magnus mentioned it before, EMBs use technologies, that's a given, but over the last several months, they had to severely accelerate. And as for a lot of governments, projects that they thought were 2 years away have actually had to be implemented in a matter of months. And it comes with a lot of different challenges. Online communication, for example, it is now the norm. It is indispensable, whether it's instant messaging or emails, they simply cannot operate without these systems. Cloud services are not present everywhere for different reasons. However, a lot of administration now have started to use them to a large extent. And I think they are becoming more important, and they will eventually become the norm in most environments, with a few exceptions. But whether it's for informal file sharing among coworkers or it's part of a large corporate programs, it's difficult to imagine now not using any kind of cloud services. And when it comes to election-specific applications, a lot of work is now done with online systems. They are not necessarily open to the public, but they are web-based. There is a server that is sitting somewhere, whether it's inside the EMB data center or whether it's somewhere in the cloud with a third-party companies. It is somewhere out there, and it's available online through the browser of the users. Also, working from home was an exception, sometimes completely inexistent, and all of a sudden it has become a routine for a lot of people. And it was largely improvised, with not a lot of policies or procedures, just people asked to try to continue to do their job from home and not coming to the office. And people do not have an IT department at home to secure their internet connection or their computer. And that comes with a lot of challenges. And in the rush, a lot of consumer grade products that were free have started to be used in a work environment. And I'm sure people have heard about the Zoom issues that were very public at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. When it comes to like purely services to voters. There's a few that I will mention here briefly. Meredith will talk a lot more about internet voting shortly, but it definitely falls under this category. But also facilitating voter registration. I think this had to somehow be put in place to prevent large gathering of people. So it has become in a lot of countries a lot more easier to change your address online, for example, or to to provide some information to the registration offices. And the same goes with candidate registration. There's a lot of EMBs that have started to facilitate this process, at least partially, sometimes completely online. And separately, but not also very important, I think the fact that it's not only the EMBs, it's also political parties, for example. And 2020 is really the year where online campaign and Zoom rallies are happening all over the place. And this has a large impact on how they organize and the new risk that they create. And overall, how the organization of all of these activities are conducted. And this comes with a lot of risk. Beata mentioned the word attack surface before, and I think it's important to define it a little bit here. So I prepare my definition. It's the sum of all the ways you can compromise a system. So, for example, if an EMB is only using an email, well, the only way to attack via a cyber attack is to compromise the email. If you have a cloud storage, an email, a website, social media account, online database for voter registration, online registration for political parties, instant messaging to talk to your polling station representative, this is the attack surface. And it all of a sudden becomes very, very large. And all of this has to be protected with sometimes a large and most of the time unexpectedly large financial and operational cost. Sorry, I forgot to activate my slide.
Can you speak slowly?
Sorry. The COVID-19 also has been a large opportunity for attackers, and that comes with all sectors. Healthcare and financial sectors have been the most impacted, but it comes in all sectors and elections as well. Numbers vary depending on who is counting, but many studies mention an increase of 400 or 600% of email scams during the first few months of this year. So this is a large number of emails that have to be filtered by the security people and the IT people in the organizations. Attacks overall, whether it's an election year or not, whether it's COVID or not, have been on the rise consistently and continuously for the last few years. I'm mentioning here a few here. Ransomware is a very, very large concern. It has become extremely important, extremely difficult over the last few months. There was even recorded the first deceased person because a hospital was under attack and couldn't receive these German ladies. Several EMBs have been the victim of ransomware as well, with different degrees of damage to their data and to their credibility. And I think last week, the state of Georgia also had part of this election system. The signature matching system was encrypted, which delayed a little bit the process, but they had good systems in place. They were able to recover. Phishing is also a continuous concern. To get a higher level of credentials that potentially could be used to alter database records. And finally, very briefly, DDoS and infrastructure attack, they happen. They are still a major concern to disrupt the election infrastructure, particularly on election day, disrupt the publication of the results online. And this can have a really large impact. And it has happened in many countries, in Ukraine, in Bulgaria, in North Macedonia, when it comes to election, but also major attacks in Estonia and Georgia that affected the whole country. So, and I think elections are a prime target for this because the payback is very high. And countries, adversary countries are also very much, the payback for them is very high. So they will try to target this, to use this opportunity. Resilience, I think it's the key word for many organizations. It's not only about the protection, it's also about the capacity for organization to continue to operate effectively during an election operation, whether it's election day or preparation phase, to continue to operate effectively. And I've listed key points here that I would like to mention. I think they are very important. The first one is cybersecurity now is a top-down approach. It's not the problem of the IT department and the network people sitting in the basement anymore. It's anybody who uses a computer or a smartphone to do their work is concerned by it. It needs to be driven by management. And it needs to be advocated, an increase of resources, it needs trainings, it needs procurement of equipment, it needs policies in the organization to reduce the cybersecurity risk. And really, that security management needs to be a responsibility of the whole organization, of the upper management, and not anymore only of the IT people. The fact also that it's impossible to protect everything to the maximum. It will be prohibitively expensive. There are good practices with regards to risk management that needs to be put in place. Analyzing the threats, determine really what are the complex cost benefits calculation that needs to be done when it comes to protecting the election infrastructures. An example, a lot of EMBs I was meeting a few years ago, they always wanted redundancy on their data centers. They wanted two. That's prohibitively expensive. They're going to use it only for the result tabulation. Would they need two data centers? Yes, but they don't need to have them ready all the time. So there's really a lot of very complex cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done to determine what are the best mitigation strategies. And which ones need to be redundant and which ones can be replaced with alternative strategies. And I think it's important to look at what other options there are to protect these infrastructures, get help from other organizations, and because EMBs on their own are unlikely to be able to mitigate all the risk. The resiliency of a very important point, the resiliency of the publicly available websites and information systems. That's a key point for the credibility of the election management bodies. One that is a little bit more difficult, I will very quickly go through it, but it's very dynamic when it comes to the capacity of election management bodies inside their organization to be able to put in place the systems that will detect issues. Sometimes it's possible to have good and strong interactions with specialized government agencies. Sometimes it's more difficult. Sometimes you have the legal framework that allows you to do that. Sometimes it prevents you to do that. So it's very fluid. It really depends. But I think the key message is that EMBs cannot do it on their own. They need strategic partnerships that will help them put in place this very difficult, very technical system in place that will allow them to monitor their infrastructure, to monitor what's happening during an election, and to be able to react quickly. The need for incident response team, I think it's crucial. Something will go wrong somehow at some point, and being able to respond to it very quickly, to have the people in place, to have the people understand what they are what they are supposed to do is going to be very important. And a lot of the time, EMBs and even the management commissioners, they expect people to just do their work, but that's not enough. I think now they need to proactively seek out the creation of team, define the responsibilities, and define what's going to be the response plan, basically a checklist. The website is under attack. Who do we call? What do we do? I think this is extremely important. It will become even more important in the future. And I'm finishing here with the cyber hygiene. The last but not least, the need for everybody to be trained extensively on cyber hygiene training. I think this is something that IFES, that Beata mentioned, IFES is doing, has done with a lot of election management bodies in Europe and Asia. Really the need for people to understand that everybody needs to be trained, or that everybody needs to understand that they have a role to play, and what are the good practices that they need to act on. Detect phishing, how to establish a backup strategy in your office, how to secure accounts using good passwords, etc., etc. So that was a very bleak and a lot of challenges, but there's a few opportunities as well, and I think they are very important to mention. And election technology that affect voters, for me, is the one that we need to be the most careful about. They need to be planned. It's really difficult for many other aspects that are non-technical to inject technology in the election process. So I think being able to plan it, even if it's difficult with the actual context, but a short feasibility study, at least some pilot, and some extensive thinking about really what can be done in a short time frame. It needs to be really done carefully. However, I think it's also an incredible opportunity for organizations to strengthen the digitalization of their administration, improve their efficiency, and have large gains of productivities and also transparency. I think this is something that they can gain immense value by increasing the digitalization of their operations. This obviously has to be done in an orderly fashion, but taking into account security and efficiency. But I think it's also a very good opportunity. So I will conclude here that now cybersecurity really, it cannot be an afterthought, whether it's technology that impact voters or if it's internal to the EMB. More systems are interconnected, and really all of them have to be taken into account at all levels. And this is the conclusion of this presentation, and I think I'm handing over to David.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, we will hand over to David at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. A reminder to everyone, this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into 5 languages. To assist our interpreters, if I can please ask all our speakers to speak slowly. David Levine at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, please.
Magnus, thank you for that introduction. And Thomas, thank you for that wonderful presentation. My name is David Levine, and I'm the Elections Integrity Fellow for the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And we are a bipartisan transatlantic initiative that looks at how to counter the threat of authoritarian interference onto democratic institutions, including, of course, elections. I'm pleased to be speaking on this topic, and I'll keep my remarks short and to the point here. For those of you that haven't had an opportunity to read Beata and my paper earlier this month, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. It's a guide to helping election officials, both at local, state, and federal level in the United States and Europe, conduct more secure elections during the pandemic. And as a former state and local election official here in the United States and a current election observer for the OSCE, I wholeheartedly endorse it. As we know, the coronavirus pandemic has introduced an additional layer of complexity, into the already challenging task of conducting secure democratic elections, as Magnus mentioned. And prior to the pandemic, as many of you on this call know, many democracies were working to secure their elections from foreign adversaries, often with very limited budgets. And those challenges, frankly, have only grown more acute because of the pandemic. Since the coronavirus has arrived, a great deal of attention has correctly been focused on how to administer elections in a manner that reduces the likelihood of everyone involved contracting the virus. However, after reviewing a number of elections that have been held since the coronavirus, right, came to us, Beata and I know many people on this call would agree that more can, should, and must be done to try and secure our elections. And as we, I think, all can agree, both the pandemic, unfortunately, as well as the threat of foreign interference show no signs of abating. So what I thought I would do is, to Beata's earlier remarks, I'd focus a little bit on some of the warnings that have come out of the FBI and the Cyber Division of the US Department of Homeland Security, not only because, of course, that's relevant with the US election going on next week, but because some of the issues that have been identified there have applicability beyond simply the United States. And just so that folks have a sense of what I'm talking about, at the end of September and into the early part of this month, those two agencies issued a series of advisories aimed at warning voters about problems that could surface in the election, as well as steps that all Americans, including election officials and voters, could take to try and counter the threat of foreign interference, particularly amid the pandemic. And I just want to touch on a few of them because of their applicability. One of the things I think that's worth noting is that these warnings run the gamut, right? From the cyber attacks targeting election infrastructure that Turnout talked about, to, of course, disinformation in our electoral process. And of course, the threat of disinformation has only been exacerbated during the pandemic. As many of you know here, right, at many times during the pandemic, we've been coming into more and more information, both about the threat it poses and about what we need to do to try and respond and best deal with it. And so even when we're talking about the pandemic and how to deal with it, there have been various points in the process, times where there's been a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how best to go about dealing with that threat. And of course, when there's uncertainty, there then is an information vacuum that bad actors can often exploit to try and sow confusion and chaos and try and undermine, right, in many cases, whatever good information is already out there. So let me just go through a couple of examples really quickly. One example that has become really problematic in both the election context, but even more broadly, is disinformation through bogus internet domains and email accounts. It's not super difficult to set up a fake or a spoofed email account or website that can closely resemble a legitimate one. Cyber criminals can regularly forge websites with slight misspellings or barely noticeable alterations to dupe or confuse internet users. For example, in the United States, a bogus website ending in .com instead of .gov could allege to have legitimate information or results that could trick people into visiting that page, thinking that that's an authentic or trustworthy government source. And besides sort of spreading false information, spoof websites can gather personally identifiable information and spread malicious software. So what can voters and others do? One of the things I think that's really important for folks on this call, as well as people more broadly, is to make sure that they're verifying the spelling of websites and email addresses that may look legitimate, but in fact are not. And that's not only applicable, of course, to the US election, but applicable to some of the other elections that are going on, either over the next couple of weeks or in the months that lay ahead. Another threat that's been raised both here in the United States, but also elsewhere, that pertains to foreign interference is disinformation through online journals. What we do know, and there's intelligence that suggests that foreign intelligence services can use websites like pseudo-academic online journals to cause confusion around the election and even try and undermine the legitimacy of the results. Right? This can, of course, include promoting claims of voter suppression and ballot fraud, criticizing individual political candidates, disseminating information about cyber attacks, both legitimate cyber attacks as well as ones that are not, and spreading otherwise misleading or alleged assertions to try and manipulate public opinion and discredit the election process. And one of the things that I think that voters who are living in societies carrying on democratic elections ought to be thinking about is how they can go about finding trustworthy sources of information. That can, of course, include information from election officials, but even in this climate, whether it's through lawsuits or through changing procedures due to the pandemic, there are even occasional times where election officials may not have the latest and greatest information. And then it's important to be able to reach out to third-party organizations such as IFES, such as the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and other third-party organizations that may be able to provide that accurate information as well. I think it's also important that when you see potential dis or misinformation, that you're trying to verify that information through multiple credible channels, so that before you recirculate that information online to others, you in fact know that there is a legitimate problem that needs to be resolved. Another issue that I think has been come about and has been exacerbated by the pandemic are false claims of hacked voter information. It does not mean, of course, that voter information can, of course, be, in some respects, hacked in different countries. But one of the issues that we're having, not only in the United States or elsewhere, is that foreign actors and cyber criminals can spread false information intended to discredit the electoral process, including by falsely claiming to have hacked and leaked voter information. And I think one of the things that's really important to know, both in the United States as well as in other places, is that while how someone voted is generally private, there's a lot of other information in terms of whether somebody's eligible to vote, for which party that they may be voting for, or even the means in which they vote that may be public and available through a variety of sources of information. And that's why I think it's really important that we're not only talking about where to get trusted sources of information, but that we're being really clear about what information is publicly available as opposed to what information is not, so that people can have confidence about what information is information that's only available to some, as well as information that might be available to others. That way, if bad actors are coming into information that in fact is widely available, people aren't necessarily worried about the integrity of the election itself. And then finally, before I conclude, cyber threats to voting systems. We can unpack that more, and I think Tomas did a really good job on this. But I think one of the things that's really important to know is that there are a number of pieces of the election infrastructure that have the ability to potentially slow down the voting process, whether it's modifications or freezes to voter registration systems or efforts to deface websites. Tomas also talked about distributed denial of service attacks, in which a server can get knocked off or at least temporarily knocked offline due to a flood of requests, which could leave an election-related website inaccessible or slower to be able to access. And I think what's important for voters to know, as well as others here on this call, is that even when there are such attacks, that often the underlying voter data isn't necessarily affected, and that election officials often have contingency plans in place to try and deal with those issues, or at least they should be. Whether that means having a backup website to continue sharing the processing and tabulation of election results, or communication contingency plans that are letting folks know about issues with their website and what alternative avenues exist to try and share information about the election. I think it's really, really important that people have a sense about what they can do in the event of that attack. And so there's a lot more that I could be talking about, but in the interest of the time, and to make sure that you have a chance, of course, to hear from our other panelists with enough time for them as well, I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I also encourage everyone to read the paper by David and Beata that he referred to in the beginning. There's a link to that paper in the chat, and also a link to further information about the work that IFES is doing in this field. Thanks again, David. I'll hand over to Meredith Applegate, Program Advisor to IFES Ukraine.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you, David and Toma, for really enlightening things that I think we're all dealing with, regardless of what country we find ourselves in right now. I wanted to talk about one specific aspect that is increasingly being raised by a variety of different electoral stakeholders in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and that is internet voting. And one of the reasons that this has become more and more appealing and discussed more and more often over the last couple months is exactly what Toma was talking about, where things are moving increasingly to online spaces. Technology is being used to make sure that we can be remote. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of how you can think about internet voting, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic ongoing. Internet voting has a few global uses, Estonia being notably the only country so far that uses internet voting for national elections. And I know that Robert will be speaking after me, so I won't go completely into Estonia, as he is very well positioned to talk further on this. A number of countries have also used internet voting for certain members of the electorate, so for specific populations. That includes Armenia, Australia, Canada, Panama, the US. Some countries have piloted internet voting and then decided against using internet voting. And this would be, for example, Norway or the UK. And some countries initially decided to use internet voting and then decided to discontinue its use, such as the Netherlands, Spain, France. So I want to frame this discussion of internet voting amongst 5 sort of key parameters. The first being cost, the second being participation. So will internet voting improve participation? The next is efficiency. So will internet voting make the voting and counting process more efficient, including the dispute process? Will the public trust the results of an election held through remote internet voting? And finally, is there adequate security in place? So one of the main appeals that you hear some people talk about is that internet voting could be a cost-saving measure because you don't necessarily have to have printed ballots. You don't need poll workers in polling stations. I would say that IFES's position is to be skeptical of claims that appear a little too good to be true. It's very important to be aware of hidden costs of internet voting. So what is the infrastructure that is currently in place in your country? What is the level of information that people of all levels of election management have about technology, about cyber hygiene, about vulnerabilities that will occur if you switch to a remote online voting system? And recognize that there is an important investment that takes time in infrastructure to develop. So looking at COVID-19, for example, and saying tomorrow we're going to decide to hold internet voting online, it's to hold remote internet voting is a bit of a dangerous scenario. As with the introduction of any technology, it has to be really purposeful, really well planned, really consulted before you make a change. And saving money is maybe something that you can look at in the long term, but you have to have a very realistic evaluation of what investment in resources and in human time that you'll need to be able to implement internet voting. So another big thing that people talk about, particularly with COVID-19, is would internet voting increase voter turnout? Most of the data on internet voting is pre-COVID-19 when you look at turnout. So it's really difficult to answer this question right now, particularly since now people are concerned about going to the polls in person. Pandemics present really specific, untested situations, but there are some lessons to be learned. For example, in Norway, there was an expectation when they piloted internet voting that it would raise the participation, particularly of young people. And when they piloted it, they didn't actually see that was the case. The same people were voting, they were just voting now online instead of going to the polling station. However, there are some appealing things for internet voting for accessibility, for people with disabilities. Being able to use screen readers, being able to use your own device can particularly be a benefit for people who have visual disabilities in particular. But turnout considerations have to be weighed with other factors in mind as well. Talking about efficiency, it's a possibility, depending on the type of infrastructure you have, that you might be able to see results more early, is a theory that some people have about internet voting. But first, you have to consider the level of IT literacy and infrastructure in a country. You have to consider the legality of internet voting and any necessary amendments that would have to be made to the legal framework, and consider how much time that's going to take. You also have to consider audits and end-to-end verifiability. So if you're going to wind up having a contested election that lasts over several months to have a dispute resolved, is it necessarily more efficient? Or if you can amend the legal framework quickly, or if it's a more long process to build the legal framework in each country. Public trust links really closely to what David was talking about. So will voters trust this technology? This links to a lot of things that we've heard about with COVID-19 that David touched upon, which is increased disinformation, a lot of conflicting information out there. So you have to consider public perception about the confidence that they have in election management, history of fraud, what sort of information is out there. And just to give you a reference point from Ukraine, where I am right now, in Ukraine, 37% of the public support internet voting, but only 26% think that voting on the internet is not vulnerable to tampering or manipulation. So initially people say, absolutely, I would love to vote online. But then when they start to think about whether or not they would trust the results, whether or not they think it's secure, it's actually a very, very low number of people who would trust this as a method for deciding who their elected representatives are going to be. And then finally, this ties into security and whether or not online voting is safe. So any country who's considering implementing or piloting internet voting should undertake a full security risk assessment. This should look at a variety of potential points of vulnerability. So this should be the voter user level, election officials, system administrators, and vendors. It also should take into account personal security, so both online security as well as in-person security. So if you have someone voting remotely online, how vulnerable will they be to pressure from people who may be in the room with them, because you no longer have a polling station where secrecy of the vote is necessarily secured. So with that, I'll wrap up my comments on internet voting by saying that there's also an IFES paper out that was published this year called Considerations on Internet Voting, an overview for electoral decision makers, and it is available on the ifes.org website. And one of the co-authors of this paper with me is Toma, who presented earlier. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith, and we'll make sure to post a link to that paper as well. Seems that internet voting is not entirely uncomplicated. Our final panelist is Robert Krimmer, Professor of E-Governance at the University of Tartu. Robert, please.
Magnus, thank you so much. And dear fellow colleagues, it's a great honor to be able to speak to you today on this important topic of how we can address the issue of cybersecurity around technologies and how we can actually counter the problem of basically taking away human interaction in elections, right? I mean, that's exactly what is the problem at hand, right? I mean, when we all know from the luxury of having a delivery service for our takeaway that is being put in front of our doors with the contactless delivery, the question is, how can we make our elections COVID safe, right? And that means in one way or the other, we could use more technology, as Meredith just said. I mean, internet voting seems to be one possibility for delivering this election contactless, but certainly it has other issues that make elections in one way or the other more complicated, right? And so there is a trade-off whether you actually have more safety from a pandemic, or you actually have security risks at hand. And so if you want to manage those security risks and those increased risks that also David highlighted, and Thomas and Beata earlier on, then you need to have capacity with the election management bodies. And I will try now to speak slower, reminding what Magnus said earlier about the interpreters. Having this capacity means that you need to build up the knowledge. You need to build up the experience with your colleagues in the management body, in the election management. You cannot buy that, because that will essentially mean that you're outsourcing democracy to those experts that might not even be fully working with you in the commission. So you actually need to mainstream it. The only way how to build up that knowledge is through training and through actually changing the mindset of having something that's purely relying on paper. I don't know any election that only works with paper anymore. Maybe for the voting process, but certainly not for the preparation. So actually changing the mindset into a digital one, meaning be mindful, what does it mean if you represent information, not through a stroke on a piece of paper, but rather through zeros and ones. And that not only has to do with costs or with complexities, but essentially down to the level of understanding. And that is what is at stake, that you take away understanding from an election if you just blindly introduce technology into the process without carefully updating, upgrading, and enhancing the capacities of your management body. In that sense, I want to urge you all to carefully study what has been available in the domain of introducing technology to elections. On the one hand side, what's available at international academic conferences, like the one that we have every year in Bregenz, Austria, which we held for the first time online this year. And I will post in the chat the link to its proceedings, which are available in open access. So thank you very much all for contributing to that. And then the other element really is about how can we counter this pandemic? And I would like to come back to this idea or this need for contactless elections. And I would say essentially there is three forms or three possibilities on how you can counter that. The first one, as I have also discussed this morning with the colleagues in South Korea, which debated on how the pandemic impacts elections, is really to take very careful precautions on preparing your elections through social distancing, through using hygiene measures, and to be really mindful of how we can ensure the maximum safety for staff and voters. We have seen in the past elections that didn't take good care of that, a surge of the infections after an election day, and that is a big danger when we now think about the pandemic situation also in Georgia with the upcoming elections. It's not very promising what we see there. So it hopefully will give enough attention to the safety precautions. So having such a setup is difficult and it requires a lot of logistical preparations, but it is doable, as has been shown in the past. The second way, and that's currently the one that we see most commonly used in the United States, is really advanced voting in one way or the other, including through postal voting systems. That actually requires a lot of additional stakeholders in the electoral process that you normally wouldn't have to that extent in there, like the postal system. Think about all those issues that are not necessarily something that we would normally see with paper-based elections. When we talk about honeypots that we know from cybersecurity, where you try to identify with fake ballot boxes how people are trying to attack an election. And we have seen that with the fake ballot box and with the fake mailboxes that have been set up by one party in the US, right? So I mean, very similar tactics, but we would have never thought of that. And the only way how to counter that again is training, is education for people. So also postal voting, I would say, is the one that's the most robust in this setup that we have right now, because the systems exist, but you need to tune a bit the preparations for that, and we need to be a bit more mindful on how you set it up. And then last but not least, the internet voting system, I would say that's certainly the one that seems to be most destined for this contactless scenario, but it requires a lot of preparations. And what happens if you introduce that overnight, like we have in the Lithuanian example, where 3 months ago, the politicians decided without consulting the election management body, let's introduce internet voting for people living abroad. I mean, that's a nice idea, but in practice, it is not possible to do, right? So with these 3 possibilities, probably the one more doable when you have the capacity for the election management body is hygiene, is having the necessary social distancing in the election. Second one, postal voting is probably the easiest if you already have postal voting to upgrade the capacities there. And, you know, I mean, we're trusting for the postal system for such a long time. Why start doubting it in such a large extent? It's just, yeah, I'm not going to go there. And then last but not least, go for the complicated option of internet voting. I think there we need to be very careful. As I always say, internet voting is always for the election after next, right? You never plan for this election. You always plan for the next one because you always run out of time. So that I have also written up in a debate paper that I'm also going to share here. And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. And we will then open for questions or comments. And as I mentioned in the beginning, if you do have a comment or a question, please type it in using the chat function. And while people are doing that, I'll ask some of the questions that have come in already. First question, not entirely uncomplicated, relating to what EMBs should or should not disclose in regard of a cyber attack. And maybe Thomas and Beata, working directly with the EMBs, could answer this. So basically the question is, if a cyber attack happens in relation to an election, what should EMBs say publicly? Because obviously this issue of openness and being, sharing information about elections and what is happening. On the other hand, there's the issue of confidence or potential damage to the electoral process. So Beata, if you want to address that question.
Great. Yeah, so I'll just start off quickly and then I'll pass over to Thomas and to others who I think will have more in-depth reactions to this. But really, there was a previous understanding of security through obscurity that many countries practiced, where they believed that the less information that was in the public domain, the more secure they would be. And this really has been debunked, especially post-2016. And I'm not saying that all levels of information warrant transparency, and there may be time periods and staggering that need to happen, but there is a general acceptance now that the more credible and transparent the information that's being provided, and the more information that the public has about what is taking place, the more they're likely to have confidence and trust in the process overall. And that is something which is really fundamental when dealing with elections in the technology space. But I'll pass out over to others to give more in-depth to this.
Thomas, do you want to give your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think for me, there's a couple of parameters here. One of them is if the fact that publishing and talking about the attack makes the damage, the potential damage higher by talking about weaknesses that are currently in place or that could have appeared by the type of attack that is ongoing, then it should not be divulged. I think that's clear. That sounds obvious, but in the rush of being under attack and having to answer to the press, that's not something people might think of. So you need to think about the implication of what you are going to publish in terms of further damaging your infrastructure and your systems. And the second aspect is and Beata touched on this. It's also the fact that the security through obscurity doesn't work, but there is also a lot of transparency that is actually not transparency. It's published unverified information, and that might damage your credibility as well. I mean, if there are already information that are circulating about an attack, and you decide to not disclose information, then you are further damaging your credibility. I think you need to balance also a little bit this aspect of looking at what's out there in terms of information and reacting based on that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And if other panelists have views on this issue as well, I'll ask you to respond to that. But I also have other questions that have been sent in. One question to David is, apart from what you mentioned during your presentation, what can voters do to play their role in protecting their electoral process against foreign attacks?
Sure. It's a great question. I'll just make a couple of points. Number one, vote. I think if everyone chose to vote in their given country's elections, right, that would go an awfully long ways towards mitigating the threat of foreign interference. I think the second thing, which is applicable to the US, but frankly, it's also applicable to a lot of other countries, is finding a way to be part of the process of helping defend your elections. And, that can include being poll worker or a worker, right, that helps, be part of the election process, helping make sure that voters are treated properly, that their eligibility is verified, and that their ballots are successfully counted. And the third thing I'll add very briefly is that if you're not going to be a worker, think about being an observer for the election process. These elections that are going on in countries all across the world, in some respects, are going to be dramatically different than they have been before, for points that my other panelists have all sort of pointed out. And so one of the things that helps ensure the integrity of those elections is having professionals who are there to help ensure that the process is above board and fair and observable. And to go back to sort of the question that came before, Magnus, having been a previous state and local election official, right? Let me, I think, add some practical language to that question. I think it's important to step forward when you have, right, information that you feel reasonably confident about, that doesn't, to Thomas's point, right, lead to any other security concerns, and share that information. So that folks understand that as you go through the process, if there's an instance of an attack or anything else, that people may be getting updates. This isn't just about ensuring your election infrastructure, obviously vis-a-vis malicious actors. It's also so that voters, any of whom may be affected, can take action. Robert talked about or alluded to instances of drop boxes in the United States having issues. One of the things that I think election officials have done in those instances is to share what specifically happened, who might have been impacted, and what they need to do as a result. And I think that's really important. If you can't do that, then I think that's going to be a real cause for concern for everybody that's part of your election process.
Thank you very much, David. Very good answer. I have a question for Meredith. Well, this is quite a short question. Does IFES recommend countries to use internet voting?
It's a very good question. So IFES does not recommend for or against internet voting necessarily, but what IFES recommends against is implementing any electoral technology too quickly, for example, as a response to a pandemic like COVID-19. And without sufficient testing, piloting, consultation, training, internet voting could be considered one of the most complex transitions that a country could make, and it has to be done with extreme care. There needs to be sufficient public trust, which is often overlooked, but quite critical to using technology successful in elections. I think quite a few of us on this call have worked in countries where technology has been implemented too quickly or without adequate consultation, and this sometimes has very severe repercussions on whether people accept election results. So while IFES doesn't recommend for or against internet voting, we do recommend that a number of factors are carefully considered, And to be successful, this takes time and significant investment.
Thank you very much, Meredith. We have had a question come in. It relates to partly, I think, the first question about what to disclose in the context of a cyber attack. And the question is, what about countries in which GDPR is effective, most of Europe, and the EMB is forced to publish the breach? So basically, what impact do we see that GDPR and I guess privacy legislation in general would have regarding to what EMBs can, cannot, should not release in this regard? Who would like to address us? Thomas?
Yeah, I'll take it. So, well, so the GDPR in the context of election would only impact voter registration data or potentially candidates' data, but it's about personal identifiable information. So it restricts the kind of attacks. I mean, it's a DDoS attacks the result website, GDPR is not applicable. But when it comes to a breach of personal data, there are special provisions for elections, which I'm not an expert on, so I can't do a long explanation on that. But there are special provisions that apply. There are no special provisions when it comes to breach of data. So if there is an attack, an EMB would have to report the breach to the authorities, to the relevant authorities in 72 hours. I think that's the rule. But aside from that, it only applies to, it really only applies to personal identifiable information. So it's very limited in scope in terms of the impact.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I have a question for Robert that's come in. You talked a lot about warning, basically, against introduction of technology. The question is, can you give an example of when technology has been introduced in an electoral process without the care and consideration that you recommend?
No, I mean, I think the point is really care, right? So, I mean, to really see about what makes sense and what actually addresses the needs of a given electoral context. That's the important fact there. Introducing technology for the wrong reasons, because, for example, of the wish to become a leading nation, to be an early adopter of technology, is the wrong reasons. Think about the case in Ireland, where voting machines were introduced from one election to the other without actually considering also the change management process, that if you have results available overnight in a country where it used to take a week to get the results, where politicians were preparing for receding from a race and so on, then this causes disruption. Yeah, disruption might be a good thing when we talk about innovation, but not so good when we talk about a democratic process that really builds up social capital. So that's the thing to think about. I mean, why does Switzerland have a 100-year-long calendar for referenda? Yeah, I mean, they know when they will hold referenda in the year 2099. Because they are a stable democracy, they plan ahead and they very carefully introduce changes. And if they don't work, like what they had with internet voting systems where they detected mistakes, they take it back. So careful consideration, don't rush things, and be willing to admit errors and go back, and then think about how you can introduce it in a better way in the future. And that's the Swiss example shows, right? But that of course costs money and resources, and you need to have them and you need to plan for them, as every merchant does, right? They always keep this extra money for the pandemic, for the unforeseen goods. And that's the same thing an EMB needs to do when they introduce technology.
Thank you very much, Robert. Beata?
Yeah, if I could just come in on that point as well. You know, in many societies, there is a reaction where there are fundamental problems with the process or the administration or the trust in election processes, to try to bring in technology to solve those problems in the hope that that will somehow make it go away. And I think the lesson learned across the globe is that that rarely happens. And if you don't fix those kinds of fundamental issues and build that kind of trust within your population to election processes. Bringing in technology will only obfuscate and further undermine people's trust in democracy and in elections. So it's really essential, as Robert was saying, to underscore and define properly what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and is technology really the best solution to that problem, or are there other types of fixes which may be more appropriate and build that confidence that you need?
Thank you very much, Beata. We have one very technical question. Do you think that 5G could increase the security of internet voting? Who would like to respond to that?
Okay, Magnus, if I just quickly try to address this. The issue of internet voting is that you need to, on the one hand side, make sure that you know who the voter is, and on the other hand, make sure that the vote is kept secret. And essentially, the internet and information systems are systems of perfect information, right? Secret vote. You distribute information wisely. Changing the speed of the internet system, meaning 5G instead of 4G, doesn't change anything, because the underlying layer of security is still the same improbable one as we have with other forms of internet access. So changing the form of internet access won't do any difference to having more secure internet voting. It will just go quicker instead of a second, half a second maybe.
Thank you very much, Robert. Does any of our other panelists want to address this issue? It seems not. What I would like to do is then to ask each of our panelists for your final words. What is the most important thing for our participants to take with them from this discussion? What are the most important things that we need to do? So who would like to go first and give us your final words? 1 minute, maximum 2. David?
Sure, Magnus. Again, thank you for this opportunity and this really sort of thoughtful conversation. I'll make a couple of points. Number one, for anyone who administers an election, I think we can all agree that there are as many challenges in some respects as there's ever been in terms of conducting an election. And as a result of the pandemic, the costs of simply administering an election are humongous, let alone the process of then securing them. I think it's really important, right, that those who are involved in elections think real critically about what resources you have available, prioritize what your needs are, and make sure that securing elections is equally as important, right, as administering them as well. I think one of the real challenges that's existed because of the pandemic is that people with little funds to run elections in the first place had to deal with less, which in some ways can make you more vulnerable. Many of the solutions that we have spoken here on the panel about, we've talked about is taking additional steps to make sure you're okay, carefully implementing technology. Whether you do that by running a pilot election or a tabletop exercise, or you do more things to prevent, detect, or recover from attacks, these cost money. And it's really important that you are laying and listing these out, identifying costs, and going to your stakeholders that help determine your budget so that you have a real good understanding about what you need to do to get to a place of conducting and administering secure elections during this coronavirus.
Thank you very much, David. Who would like to go next? Thomas, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, for me, I would like to conclude really on the opportunities, because I think we've painted a lot of bleak pictures, but there's also incredible opportunities to gain from what's been happening over the last few months in terms of gain of productivity, in terms of increasing the transparency of the way EMBs work, in terms of improving the accessibility of a lot of things that EMBs do, and a lot of things that are happening in the election cycle, allowing observers, allowing political party agents to register online is also very, it's a very important benefit, and allow voters to change their polling location without, without having to physically go to an office is also a very important benefit. So I think there are lots of opportunities if you consider these three things, like productivity, transparency, and accessibility. And I wanted really to finish on that. There's also all of the security aspect that we've talked about very extensively here during the meeting. But I think we should also look at the opportunities and keep both of them in sight.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Robert, you have final words for us?
Reduce complexity, right? So, I mean, don't add technology where you don't need it, and keep it simple and beautiful, yeah? Because that means you can control it, and democracy in the end is about people. So if you take the people out of the electoral process, what is left, right? So think about where technology can actually help you, right? Technology was first added in the 1850s to communicate the election results in the presidential elections. So for the first time, you could actually hold an election on the same day with having the results on the same day, right? That's where it can add, right? Where there is not that much of an issue. So you can actually have an additional benefit. But just introducing the technology because it looks cool, I mean, we're not driving an electric car. So keep it small and simple.
Excellent words. Thank you very much, Robert. Meredith, I would like to ask you for some final words.
Thanks, Magnus. Well, first, I'd just like to thank all of my fellow panelists and the participants for joining today, and thank Magnus and Beata. I completely agree with all of the panelists that our interactions, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, are increasingly moving to online spaces and using technology. So these discussions are incredibly important to be considering and thinking about closely. I guess the thing that I would like to end on is that it's just essential to understand that the process in how election technology is introduced is essential to confidence, trust, and security. And we should all be wary of leaping to introduce a new technology like internet voting in response to the pandemic without considering how it impacts everything else.
Thank you very much, Meredith. And I think it's suitable that we give the last word to IFES Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz.
Thank you very much. No, it's really been a great number of presentations and a great discussion. So I thank everyone who's been here, both to present, but also for the questions that the audience has given to us. From my side, I would say one of the most fundamental changes that's really happened is that these decisions about technology in elections are no longer a question of just national issues or internal discussions. I think since 2007 and the Estonian cyber attack, it's increasingly clear that decisions that a country makes either at the national level or even at the county level are ones which have international implications, that there are now foreign threat actors who are looking to disrupt those processes and undermine democratic processes. And that's been increasingly clear, especially since the 2014 Ukraine attack. And so really to fundamentally go back to a proper evaluation and a proper feasibility study of what are the problems that election administrators are seeking to solve, what are the various tools that are at their disposal in order to fix those issues, and whether in that mix technology has a role, but really looking at the, the people, as Robert said, rather than trying to put technology in as a first gut reaction and then having to deal with the problems, the undermining of confidence, and the lack of security that's become increasingly apparent in many of the processes that have been introduced. From IFES side, we're developing our capacity to help election management bodies, to help other key stakeholders in this field, to promote discussions like this in a more open environment, but also to assist at a very fundamental and deep level for various countries that are going through these processes. And we're really happy to continue this discussion and to continue to inform you about the developments, the tools, and the processes that we're engaging in. So thank you for all of you and your participation, and back over to Magnus.
Thank you very much, Beata. So we're coming to the end. Thank all our panelists, all of you for participating. I want to thank USAID again for supporting this event. Thank our interpreters and my IFES colleagues for the technical preparations and management. Remember, at the beginning of this, I mentioned the IFES US election program, which includes a lot of interesting information about the elections that happened in the US next week. The program has actually already started. It started today. It will continue as we move forward. Among other things, there will be an event on defending democracy with big major IT companies. Microsoft will be hosting. This is at 2 p.m. Central European time this Thursday. And there's a session on technology and elections next Wednesday at 3 p.m. CET. So to register, you go to usep.ifes.org. And again, we've put the link to that in the chat function. When you plan your participation in USEP, please remember that we changed our clocks last Sunday. They changed their clocks next Sunday. So check that you are considering it the right time. The next installment for this webinar series, the date and the topic will be announced at a later date. But again, until then, I thank you all and hope that you will all stay safe. Thank you.